She was 27, the daughter of a dead blacksmith, and the town of Carbon Creek thought she had lost her mind. With the last of her inheritance, 2 stout mules and a heavy wagon, and every foot of chain her father had ever forged, she was trying to move a dead locomotive. It sat rusted to the rails on a forgotten spur line, a monument to a failed silver mine and the railroad's indifference. They said she had no family, no money, and no sense. Just a stubborn set to her jaw and a fool's attachment to scrap iron. But what nobody in that Wyoming valley knew, what the railroad foreman who mocked her had long forgotten, was that the engine's coal tender was double-walled for the high mountain passes. And a thing like that, as her father once wrote in his ledger, was never truly empty. Settle in and stay close for this one. And in the comments below, let us know where you're watching from tonight. We'd love to hear from you. Ellen Marsh had grown up in the rhythmic world of her father's smithy, a world defined by the hiss of hot steel in the slack tub and the deep, percussive breath of the great bellows. Her father, Thomas Marsh, was a man of few words and capable hands, a master of his craft, who saw the world not as a collection of people and problems, but as a series of things that needed mending, strengthening, or making. He had come to Wyoming with the railroad, laying track and repairing engines, but had settled in Carbon Creek to serve the miners, ranchers, and townsfolk, his forge glowing like a steady heart in the center of the small, wind-scoured community. Ellen was his only child, her mother having been taken by a fever when she was just a girl, and she became his shadow, his apprentice, his legacy. While other girls were learning needlepoint, Ellen was learning the different colors of heated iron, the pale straw yellow for tempering a chisel, the cherry red for a workable bend, the brilliant, almost white heat for a perfect forge weld. Her father never treated her skills as a curiosity. To him, it was simply work, and Ellen had a talent for it. He taught her how to read the grain in a piece of steel, how to listen for the flaw in an axle with the tap of a hammer, and how to coax a true, straight line from a warped bar of iron. For her 10th birthday, he had forged her a small cross-peen hammer, its head no bigger than a hen's egg, its hickory handle shaped perfectly for her hand. It was a tool of exquisite balance and utility, a miniature version of his own, and it became the object through which she understood his quiet, profound love. She carried it always in the pocket of her canvas trousers. His death, when it came, was as quiet and unyielding as the man himself. A lung sickness, born of years breathing coal dust and metal filings, had taken him slowly, until one morning he simply did not rise from his bed. He left behind a legacy of good work, a town full of tools he had mended and plows he had sharpened, but also a ledger full of debts. The cost of iron and high-grade coal, the new anvil shipped from Pittsburgh, the credit he extended to ranchers during the hard winter, it all added up. The ejection was not a single dramatic event, but a slow, administrative grinding away of her world. Miss Abernathy, the town banker and head of the council, a man whose carriage horses wore shoes forged by her father, explained the situation with a regret that felt thin and practiced. The smithy and the land it stood on would have to be sold to clear Thomas Marsh's accounts. A buyer had already been found, a businessman from Cheyenne who planned to install a new man, someone with modern ideas. Ellen stood in the cool, dim office, her hands clasped behind her back, and listened. She did not plead or argue. The numbers were what they were, as unchangeable as the tensile strength of cold-rolled steel. The day the papers were signed, she walked back to the smithy, the air already feeling alien in the space that had been her entire life. The smell of coal smoke and quenching oil was fading, replaced by the scent of dust and finality. The new owner had given her 3 days to clear out her personal effects. Everything else, the forge, the anvil, the great cone mandrel, the leg vis bolted to a post her father had set himself, belonged to the bank now. The foreman for the Union Pacific Spur, Frank Pike, a broad-shouldered man with a voice accustomed to shouting over the noise of steam engines, came by on the second day. He looked around the silent shop, his eyes assessing everything for its scrap value. He offered her a flat price for the remaining stock of bar iron, the odds and ends, and the tools not considered part of the building itself. "It's a fair price, Ellen," he said, his tone attempting kindness, but landing on pity. "More than you'd get from the scrapper." He then gestured to the 2 old mules and the heavy freight wagon in the yard. "I'll take the team and wagon too, help you get a fresh start somewhere else." She looked at the mules, Patience and Foley, her father's last living assets. She nodded slowly. "I'll sell you the team and wagon," she said, her voice even, "but not the chains." Pike frowned, looking at the heavy, intricate loops of chain hanging from a rafter, each link perfectly welded, a testament to her father's skill. "What do you need with all that chain?" he asked, a hint of impatience in his voice. "It's just dead weight." She met his gaze. "It's my father's work," she said, and that was all. He shrugged, paid her the agreed-upon sum in cash, and left her with a pocket full of bills, her father's little hammer, and a pile of heavy, dark chain. Her journey was short in distance, but immense in its finality. She loaded the chains onto a small handcart she had built herself years ago, the iron links clanking a mournful rhythm on the wooden bed. Pulling the cart, she walked out of the town of Carbon Creek, leaving the smithy and the life within it behind her. She did not look back. Her path took her east, following the line of the railroad tracks as they wound their way out of the small cluster of buildings and into the open valley. The wind, a constant presence in this part of Wyoming, pushed against her, carrying the scent of pine and the sharp, clean smell of distant snow. The sky was a vast, indifferent blue, dotted with high, thin clouds that promised colder weather to come. It was a landscape that tolerated human endeavor, but never fully embraced it. A place of hard ground and stark beauty. Her destination was a place most people in town had forgotten, a short, dead-end spur line that branched off the main railway about 2 miles out. It had been built a decade ago to service a silver mine high in the Laramie Mountains, but the vein had run dry within a year, and the railroad, having no more use for it, had simply abandoned it. They had pulled up the valuable switches and signals, but had left the last engine that had serviced the line sitting right where it had stopped. It was too remote, and the scrap value too low, to justify the cost of hauling it out. To everyone else, it was an eyesore, a piece of industrial refuse slowly surrendering to the elements. To Ellen, it was something else entirely. As she drew closer, the locomotive grew on the horizon, a black, hulking shape against the pale green of the sagebrush. It was a Baldwin 440, an American-type engine, once the proud workhorse of the frontier. Now its iron hide was blistered with rust, its cab windows shattered, its great driving wheels half buried in the hard-packed soil. The silence around it was profound, broken only by the wind whistling through the holes in its boiler jacket. She stopped the handcart and walked a slow circle around the machine, her calloused fingers tracing the lines of rust and decay. She saw the frozen pistons, the cracked connecting rods, the general state of ruin, but she also saw the integrity of the main frame, the solid construction of the tender, the sheer volume of raw material it represented. She felt the cold, solid reality of it beneath her hands. It was not a ruin, it was a resource. It was a problem of engineering, and that was a language she understood. The acquisition of the derelict locomotive was a simple, almost absurdly bureaucratic act that stood in stark contrast to the physical immensity of the object itself. Ellen walked back to town the next morning, the small roll of bills from Frank Pike tucked securely in her pocket. She went not to the bank or the general store, but to the county land office, a dusty, little-used room at the back of the courthouse. The clerk, a balding man named Mr. Chique, Hemlock, looked up over his spectacles as she entered, his expression a mixture of boredom and surprise. Few people had business there. "Help you?" he mumbled, not bothering to rise. "I'd like to file a salvage claim," Ellen said, her voice clear and steady in the quiet room. "On the abandoned locomotive. Engine 73, on the old mountain spur." Hemlock blinked. He put down his pen and stared at her. "The old Baldwin? Child, What in God's name for? That thing is naught but a pile of rust. I have my reasons, Ellen replied simply. What is the fee? The clerk sighed, a long, weary sound, and pulled a massive leather-bound ledger from a shelf. He ran a dusty finger down a page, squinting at the spidery script. Abandoned railroad property on unregistered right-of-way. Falls under territorial salvage law. $10 for the claim filing. Gives you sole right to whatever you can haul off. He looked at her again, a flicker of something. Pity, perhaps, or disbelief in his eyes. It's your money. Ellen counted out $10 from her small hoard, the crisp bills looking flimsy and insignificant on the massive wooden desk. Mr. Hemlock painstakingly filled out a form in triplicate, the scratching of his nib the only sound. He handed her one of the copies. It was a simple piece of paper, but it was a deed. It made the iron monster hers. When she returned to the spur line, she was not alone. Word had traveled fast in a town as small as Carbon Creek. Frank Pike was there, leaning against his wagon, his arms crossed over his chest. A few other men from the railroad yard and a couple of curious ranchers stood at a distance, watching. Heard you bought yourself a train, Ellen. Pike called out, a smirk playing on his lips. Planning on driving it to Cheyenne? Laughter rippled through the small group of onlookers. Ellen ignored them. She unhooked the mules, Patience and Foley, from the wagon she had just sold to Pike, and led them to the front of the locomotive. She began the slow, methodical process of rigging the chains, looping them around the main frame, and connecting them to the mules' heavy work harnesses. It was a task of immense complexity, requiring a deep understanding of leverage and load distribution. Pike watched, his amusement slowly giving way to a grudging respect for her skill. You'll kill those mules, girl, he said, his voice losing some of its mocking edge. That engine weighs 50 tons. You can't move it. I don't have to move it far, she said, not looking at him. Just off the rails. The discovery was not a moment of sudden, dramatic revelation, but the culmination of patient, arduous labor. For 3 days, Ellen worked. She did not try to move the entire locomotive at once, as Frank Pike and the others had assumed. She was a blacksmith's daughter. She knew how to break a thing down into its essential parts. Her first goal was simply to shift the massive machine enough to break the bond of rust and earth that held it fast. She used the mules not to pull, but to provide tension on the chains, while she worked with long iron bars as levers, slowly, painstakingly rocking the great wheels. The sound was a groaning, tearing shriek of metal on metal that echoed across the valley. On the third day, with a final, shuddering lurch, the locomotive slid sideways off the rails and settled into the dirt, listing at a heavy angle. The onlookers had long since grown bored and left. Only Frank Pike remained, watching from a distance, his expression unreadable. With the engine off the tracks, Ellen's real work began. She spent another week methodically disassembling what she could. She used her father's tools, wrenches, chisels, and the heavy sledgehammer to remove bolts, sever pipes, and break free the smaller components. But her focus, from the very beginning, was on the tender. It was a large, rectangular car, designed to hold tons of coal and thousands of gallons of water. It sat behind the locomotive, slightly askew. She remembered a conversation with her father years ago, when a similar engine had been in his shop for repairs. He had been tapping on the wall of its tender, listening. Mountain runners, he had told her, they build them different. Double wall. For insulation. Keeps the water from freezing solid on a long winter grade. And then he had added, almost as an afterthought, a phrase that had stuck in her memory. They say you can never truly empty one. She found his old ledger among her few possessions, the one where he sketched designs and jotted notes. On a page filled with drawings of a leaf spring assembly, she found the scribble, Baldwin Mountain Tender, 440. Inner wall, 8-inch void. Packed with coal dust for insulation. It was not a letter from a hidden benefactor, but it was a map left by the one person who had always believed in her. The next morning, she went to work on the tender's forward wall. It was a solid plate of 3/4-inch steel. She chose her spot carefully, just above the frame, and began to work with a cold chisel and her father's sledge. It was brutal, punishing labor. The clang of the hammer on the chisel was a sharp, piercing report that rang in her ears. Sweat soaked her shirt, and her arms ached with a fire that went bone deep. After hours of work, she had managed to cut a deep 12-inch line into the steel. With a final, perfectly placed blow, the chisel broke through. There was no cascade of treasure. Instead, a quiet, dry whisper and a small stream of black dust and granules trickled out onto the ground. She worked the opening wider and reached inside. Her hand did not meet an empty void but a densely packed mass. It was coal, not the dusty insulation she had expected, but high-quality lump anthracite coal, perfectly dry and preserved in its steel tomb. The railroad had filled the void for weight and balance on the steep grades, a common but undocumented practice. Tucked deep inside, her probing fingers found something else. A heavy, oilcloth-wrapped crate. She dragged it out into the daylight and pried it open. Inside, nestled in grease-soaked wool, was a treasure trove of spare parts, brand-new brass injectors, a set of bronze bearings, copper tubing, gaskets, valves, and a box of heavy-duty bolts. It was a maintenance kit, forgotten for a decade. It was more than fuel. It was the raw material for survival. The rebuilding began not with a grand design, but with the most fundamental of human needs, warmth. The first snows of winter had already dusted the high peaks, and the wind carried a biting chill that promised a harsh season. Ellen knew she could not survive in a simple tent. She needed a fortress against the cold. Her gaze fell upon the locomotive's massive firebox and boiler. It was too damaged to ever hold steam again, but its thick, riveted plates were a blacksmith's dream. Over the next 2 weeks, she performed a feat of deconstruction and fabrication that would have made her father proud. Using her chisels and sledge, she painstakingly cut away a large, cylindrical section of the boiler. It was slow, brutal work, each cut requiring hundreds of precise, powerful hammer blows. She then dragged the heavy steel cylinder, which was nearly 5 feet in diameter, to the side of the tender. Using the salvaged bolts from the crate and iron bars she forged into brackets, she mounted it horizontally. She cut an opening for a fire door, and, using the salvaged flue pipes from the locomotive's smokebox, she engineered a tall, efficient chimney that rose high above the tender. She had not just built a stove, she had created a furnace. A massive, radiant heart of iron capable of turning her hidden store of anthracite coal into a formidable shield against the coming winter. While she worked on the stove, she began the construction of her shelter. She used the solid, flat side of the coal tender as the back wall of her new home. From the abandoned mine's tailings, she salvaged weathered timbers and planks, and with them, she built a sturdy lean-to structure, banking the walls with earth for insulation. The windows were scavenged from the locomotive's cab, their broken panes painstakingly replaced with greased canvas that let in a dim, watery light. The first true blizzard hit the valley with the fury of a physical assault. The wind howled, and the snow fell so thick and fast that it erased the world beyond a few feet. In town, people huddled in their poorly insulated homes, stuffing rags into the cracks around windows and burning their precious firewood at an alarming rate. The first person to seek out Ellen's strange refuge was not a friend or an ally, but a figure of quiet desperation. The widow Gable, a woman with 2 small children, appeared at her door as a wraith in the swirling snow, her shawl crusted with ice. Her husband had been a miner, killed in a rockfall 2 years prior, and she survived on the town's charity, living in a shack that was little more than a collection of boards. "Our fire's out," she said, her voice trembling, her children shivering beside her. "We have no more wood." Ellen said nothing. She simply stepped aside, holding the heavy plank door open, and let them into the overwhelming, radiant warmth of her shelter. The great boiler stove glowed with a dull red heat, and the air was dry and safe. The community did not form through declarations of friendship or formal agreements, but through a slow, quiet coalescing around the warmth of Ellen's stove. The blizzard did not relent. For 4 days, it buried the valley under a thick blanket of white, snapping telegraph lines and making travel between houses a dangerous undertaking. Word of the widow Gable's sanctuary spread not by voice, but by observation. A neighbor, seeing no smoke from the Gable shack, but light in the strange structure by the tracks, understood. Soon, others followed. The Rodriguez family, whose small adobe home had a crack in the foundation, arrived next, the father carrying a sleeping child wrapped in every blanket they owned. They brought with them a pot of beans and a string of dried chilies, placing it on the flat top of the stove without a word. The offering was a silent contract of shared survival. An old prospector named Silas Blackwood, who lived alone in a dugout by the creek, appeared on the 3rd day. He was a gnarled, wiry man with knowledge of the old ways. He looked at the growing number of people crammed into the lean to and then at the remaining timbers Ellen had salvaged. Need to expand, he stated, not as a suggestion, but as a fact. He spent the rest of the day in the howling wind, rigging a block and tackle from the locomotive's frame, using his knowledge of knots and leverage to help Ellen haul heavy beams into place. By nightfall, they had doubled the size of the shelter. People contributed what they could. One woman brought a side of bacon, another a sack of flour. The men took turns venturing into the storm to check on the town's livestock, their efforts coordinated from the relative comfort of what they were now calling the tender. On the 4th day, a figure emerged from the whiteout, leading a team of draft horses pulling a sled laden with lumber and canvas. It was Frank Pike. He was covered in snow, his face red from the wind. He did not offer an apology or an explanation. He simply looked at the crowded, steamy shelter, at the faces of the children sleeping near the stove, and then at Ellen. "The boiler flue pipes," he said, his voice loud to be heard over the wind. "We can rig them through the west wall. Create a second chimney. You can build another stove from the firebox door. It'll heat the new section." It was his form of concession, an admission offered not in words, but in work. He had brought 2 of his railroad crew, and they set to the task with professional efficiency, their movements precise and economical. Frank worked alongside them, his earlier mockery replaced by a focused, quiet intensity. He was a man who understood the mechanics of things, and he recognized in Ellen's creation a piece of engineering as practical and impressive as any locomotive he had ever run. He was no longer seeing a fool who had wasted her money on scrap. He was seeing a woman who had built a harbor in the middle of a storm. As the blizzard finally broke and a pale, watery sun emerged, the shelter by the tracks had transformed. It was no longer just Ellen's lean-to. It had become the heart of the community's winter survival. The tender, as everyone now called it, was a sprawling, seemingly chaotic, but deeply functional structure of salvaged wood, canvas, and iron, all anchored to the great, rust-colored bulk of the locomotive and its tender. 2 stoves, one made from the boiler and the other from the firebox, burned steadily, their chimneys breathing plumes of clean white smoke into the cold, crisp air. Inside, a new kind of society had taken root. The space was divided by blankets hung from the rafters, creating semi-private alcoves for the 3 families who had lost their homes entirely to the cold. A communal cooking area had formed around the larger stove, where Maria Rodriguez now presided, orchestrating meals from the pooled resources of half the town. Ellen was no longer an outcast. She was the undisputed center of this new world. People did not defer to her with overt displays of leadership, but with a quiet, constant consultation. "Ellen, Silas thinks this beam needs another brace. What iron do you have?" "Ellen, the flue is drawing smoke back. Can you take a look?" She moved through the space with a calm authority, her father's small hammer tucked into her belt, her hands as comfortable mending a child's toy as they were forging a new hinge for the main door. Her name was known now, not as the blacksmith's daughter, a title of pity and dismissal, but as Ellen Marsh, the woman who had seen a shelter where everyone else saw only scrap. Small rituals began to form, lending a sense of permanence to their temporary world. Every morning, Frank Pike would arrive with his crew, not because they were ordered to, but because they had taken on the project of reinforcing and improving the tender as their own. They brought tools, expertise, and a steady supply of salvaged materials from the railroad yard. Every evening, the inhabitants would gather as the light faded, sharing stories and making plans for the next day. The children, safe and warm for the first time in weeks, had claimed the old locomotive cab as their playhouse, their laughter a strange and beautiful sound in the heart of the metal beast. The locomotive itself had been transformed. It was no longer a symbol of failure and abandonment. Its parts had been repurposed into the bones and circulatory system of a home. It was a stove, a wall, a source of raw materials, and an anchor against the relentless Wyoming wind. It was proof that value was not an inherent quality, but a matter of vision and will. It had become a living place, filled with purpose, respected, and strangely beautiful in its functional, resilient form. In the quiet of a late afternoon, weeks after the great blizzard had passed, Ellen stood by the entrance of the tender, watching the winter sun cast long blue shadows across the snow. The air was still and cold, but inside the shelter, life hummed with a steady, quiet warmth. She could hear the low murmur of Mrs. Gable reading a story to the children, the gentle clink of Maria Rodriguez preparing the evening meal, and the rhythmic rasp of a saw as Frank and Silas worked to build a new cold storage locker against the north wall. The massive stove, her first creation from the bones of the locomotive, radiated a deep, comforting heat that could be felt even from where she stood. It was the center of their world, a sun forged from iron and coal. She pulled her father's small hammer from her belt. The hickory handle was smooth and dark from years of use, its contours molded to her grip. She held it in her palm, feeling its perfect, familiar weight. For so long, it had been her only connection to him, a tangible piece of his love in a world that had taken everything else. She looked from the small hammer to the immense, functional shelter she had built around it. She had used his tools, yes, but more importantly, she had used his way of seeing. He had taught her to look at a broken thing not for what it was, but for what it could become. He had seen the potential in a cast-off piece of iron, and he had seen the capable woman in the small girl at his side. The town had mocked her, called her a fool for wasting her last resources on a pile of rust. Frank Pike, a man who understood engines better than anyone, had seen only scrap value. But she had seen the double-walled tender, the promise of the hidden coal, the strength of the boilerplate. She had seen her father's notes in the ledger, and she had trusted them. She had trusted him. Frank walked over, wiping his hands on a rag. He didn't look at her, but at the structure. "She'll hold," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a final verdict. "Yes," Ellen said, "she will." Ellen Marsh was 27, and she was home. She had been left with nothing but 2 mules, a wagon, and a pile of old chains. She had spent the last of her money on a salvage claim for a rusted locomotive nobody wanted. It was the best $10 she had ever spent. We are all builders, in our own way, finding value in the places and people that others have overlooked. In the quiet strength of our own hands, we find the power not only to survive, but to create a space for others to be safe as well. Thank you for joining us for this story. Let us know in the comments below, what is something you have built or mended that holds a special meaning for you? We read every one. Until next time, stay warm and take care of one another.